Okay, great. Thanks so much for all of you being here today, and thanks so much to Jim for inviting me. So this actually brings me back. I haven't been in this building since the mid-90s when I was attending Jim's seminar in French history. And I was a PhD student at Berkeley, but I followed my husband here, and I was sort of an orphan, and Jim took me in, and Mac took me in. The Ancien Regime group actually let me go to their sessions. And it was hugely important to me, actually. In some ways, I think the community of scholars here in DC had more impact on the direction of my thesis than my professors at Berkeley. I should know.
I know who they
were. So thanks very much to have me back. But just thinking about being here in the 90s, I remember actually in the fall of '97, being in Jim's seminar, being very pregnant. Yes. Very pregnant. And Jim asked me to do just a little book review of Denis Couzet's Guerrière de Dieu, the 2-volume set. So I came in prepared to give my book review. I gave my book review. And then about half an hour later, Jim wanted to do a hands-on practical section of learning how to read French paleography. So he handed out 2 texts that people had never seen before. And he said, Sarah, you were just in the archives. Why don't you read it aloud to the group? And I guess I did okay, because we stayed in touch. So I have fond memories of being here and having so much support from both Jim and Mac over the years. So it's really a pleasure. So what I'd like to do today is to give you a sense of how I got to this project on torture. So my first project was quite different. And to give you a sense of sort of the overall picture of that project. And some of you have read the first chapter. So then I'll talk a little bit about the overall scheme of the book, a little bit about that first chapter, but not very much. And so then I'm hoping we can open it up to a general discussion. We can get to the meat of things more in the discussion. So my first book is called Laughing Matters, Farce of Making the Absolutism in France. And it's about the performance, patronage, censorship, imprisonment of comic theatrical players in the 16th and 17th centuries. Many in the 16th century were law clerks, the bazoches at the Parlement, so I ended up working in the Parlement archives quite a lot. But it really was a work of cultural history, looking at what can you say and avoid getting imprisoned, how far can you go before your group gets shut down. So I certainly didn't anticipate working in torture. Although I did notice on the job market that when I would present the chapters that were funny, I get those jobs. And then when I presented the chapter on Jesuit theater, which is sort of how the comic theater ends up in a funny way in my narrative, I got that job. So I did note that, and that was interesting. It could have been accidental, but so then when I started teaching, I was teaching a class on criminality and violence in early modern Europe. Sort of starting with Foucault and then showing all the research that's been done since this was unpunished that shows that he's wrong in most regards, but asked really interesting questions. I came across a lot of literature that talked about the decline of torture in the 17th century, but gave different explanations for why it took place. So looking at the Italian or the Spanish Inquisition, looking at the situation in France, and in France there was a whole narrative about state centralization, the importance of the appeals courts, the importance of having university-trained judges who knew the law and weren't using it arbitrarily. But then I look in Germany, and also in the 17th century, there's a real decline in the use of judicial torture. And so there it was explained in terms of the end of the 30 Years' War and less violence in society. So a variety of different explanations. And I thought there's got to be something going on, though, that's pan-Western Europe. This is also happening in all kinds of different places. No change in the law in these places, for the most part. Of course, there was the 1670 change in France, but by that time, torture had already declined. I think legal historians have a pretty strong consensus on that. So what was happening? Oh my! Yes. What was happening in the 17th century across Western Europe to make torture decline? So I thought this asked for more investigation. So I got from farce to torture through teaching and historiographical questions that came out of the teaching. And this drove my methodology to change. So I really thought of myself as a social and cultural historian, not as a counter. My book, Laughing Matters, has been reviewed by as many literary journals as by historical journals. It's in the P section in the Library of Congress. It really was a book that was on the borderline, and I did publish some things afterwards that were much more literary, so I could have gone that direction. But this project really demanded that I do some counting, because if you're going to say that torture declined in the 17th century, you do have to kind of prove that it did, right? So I found myself doing quantitative stuff sort of by the way. It wasn't my intention. Initially, this torture project was comparative. For the farce book, I had worked in the Parlement of Toulouse and Bordeaux and Paris, so I thought, okay, that would be a good place to start. The Jurade of Bordeaux, I knew they had some good records there. But I also wanted to push outside the bounds of France because I wanted to challenge this centralization argument. That's it's sort of a shorthand for it. And so I wanted to look in Lille and in Geneva. So I started doing preliminary research in all of those places. And in fact, in all those places you can demonstrate that torture declines in the 17th century. Some even earlier, so end of the 16th century, say with the Parlement of Paris. But often that's all you could really say. So torture would be mentioned in passing, in a final sentence, and so it wasn't bringing me closer to figuring out why. And so I found myself gravitating towards Geneva because of the records were so good. And so these publications that came out in the first years working this project sort of reflect that. So this first article, Rights of Torture and Reformation in Geneva, discussed how torture in Geneva, so a Protestant place, was still a penitential experience. That the pain of torture still had sort of sacred authority. Obviously, it didn't have salvific potential the way it would in a Catholic context. But still, before people are tortured in Geneva, they're often asked to think about their relationship with God, think about their conscience, and when they're not asked to think about those things at other times during the interrogations. But even at that point in 2012, I thought, well, I'll just write this article at Geneva because the sources are available, but I hadn't yet decided to write a book on Geneva. The article on the Canal Criminel, so the crime pamphlets published in France, I thought that would be a great source for me, because it turns out it hardly talks about torture at all, but I got an article out of it. And same thing with Bordeaux. There were materials, but again, there just wasn't enough to really dig deep. So I wrote an article comparing torture at the Jurade of Bordeaux and at the Parlement of Bordeaux, and did sort of challenge some of the assumptions that judges who aren't university trained therefore must use torture irresponsibly, because I found that they didn't. But you can see that I just started gravitating towards Geneva. I started writing the book manuscript, and a couple of articles on adultery came out, and I just keep so much stuff. So that's how I went from France to Geneva, and from farce to torture. So Geneva is a great place, I decided, ultimately. I decided I had to write a book about torture in Geneva, but keeping that comparative frame in mind. In other words, I'm using Geneva as a case study for why torture declined all over Western Europe. And I think it's an interesting place to do that. What is the documentation? So it's just exceptional. Just phenomenal. I got there, and I started reading these trials, and I thought, why has no one used this stuff before? And then the Genevans started saying, why are you here? What are you going to use these for? And literally, it's a very small archive, and people would come up and say, why are you here? Who are you? What do you want? These are my archives. Very different from working
Mine's the Turkish Ottoman archives, like.
And that's what they're
exactly
like. Yeah, no,
that's
it's really interesting. Even now, if I come to Geneva, I think, oh, I'm just going to be there for a couple of days. I'll just quickly zip into the archives. Within a day, everybody knows I've arrived. I started getting emails from people, I heard you were at the archives yesterday. So it's a very, very different place. I wasn't used to this. So the rich documentation. So they have continuous documentation from the city council, the small council, which is the executive council that also ruled on judicial questions. And you've got a continuous series from the beginning of the 16th century till the revolution. So that was the body that approved torture. And it does seem that torture was not applied unless it was approved by the council. So it's a fairly reliable set of records. Much of it has not been edited and transcribed, and so you're working with those manuscripts. And there's obviously a lot going on in those documents that aren't having to do with criminal matters. So it's a matter of sifting through. But they also have this amazing repository of full trials with dozens of witness depositions, and all the interrogations, or not always all, but many interrogations, some with torture, some without torture. So you really get to understand the logic of what the judges are thinking. In many of the 16th century trials, there are also avis de droit, so legal briefs that were commissioned by the small council. And they asked lawyers, most of them who are originally from France, who had recently immigrated to Geneva, to say, does this warrant torture according to Roman law? You know, there are also medical reports, autopsies, letters from family members. They're just incredibly, incredibly rich. And this made me realize that although at no point in any of those documents, except maybe the legal briefs, where they sort of say, in this case you should use torture because, for the most part, it's an inference that you're making, but based on all of this really, really detailed documentation. I also found Geneva useful because in a lot of ways it's quite typical in terms of its use of torture. So it's quite typical as compared to other Swiss polities and other southern German imperial cities. So you can compare it to them. So we have a situation in which torture is not limited to just one time, though the Carolina does push polities in that direction, although of course Geneva was not part of the Holy Roman Empire at this point. Well, it was claiming it wasn't part of the Holy Roman Empire. A lot of polities in the southern German lands were torturing many more times. So it's similar to other German and Swiss places. It was also interesting because it was a nice counterpoint to France. So there was no centralized regulation, there were no appeals courts. Essentially, there is the possibility for elite men to appeal sentences, but it was used fairly sparingly, and I've argued elsewhere, and not in a very aggressive way. In other words, the council of 200 that they appealed to often usually agreed with the small council. The judges were certainly not university trained, and yet there was a very clear decline in the use of torture by 1650. So I thought it was a useful counterpoint to sort of challenge that centralization narrative that the French historians were relying on. Of course, it's also atypical. Right? Calvin. But that sort of makes it an interesting place to write a book, right? So I think that the people who work on consistories think that I had a grand plan to come to Geneva and talk about torture under Calvin, and I really didn't. I came to Geneva because Bill Nafee wrote about crime in his Calvin and the Consolidation book, and I thought this was just a tiny section in a big chapter, and I thought if he's been able to pull these numbers together so quickly, for just a subsection of a chapter, there have got to be really good records. And so I went to Geneva, and there are really rich records. So I still think of this book, though, as a book about Geneva, but a book that's really about Geneva as a way to problematize and think creatively about the use of torture in the rest of Western Europe. So I hope that's what it ends up being. However, I did find myself counting. And once I started counting, I found that activist torture peaks at the height of Calvin's powers in the early 1560s. And I would not argue that that is mostly to do with Calvin. He's a necessary but not sufficient reason for it. In other words, he certainly felt that sin and crime should be punished violently. He had no qualms about that, and he certainly had no qualms about the consistory referring many, many hundreds of people to the small court for sins to be punished by the secular court. But for me, this really isn't a story about Calvin. There are important institutional changes that are happening in Geneva. Geneva breaks away from the House of Savoy in the 1520s and 30s. So it's a new state, it's a fledgling state, it's a state that's under threat, and that's the kind of environment which you're going to see a lot of torture and execution as the state starts to consolidate. Also, I think it has to do with consolidation of a particular oligarchy, which is, I can talk more about in the question period. So I have it here, Calvin, but it's not just about Calvin. However, it is dramatic. Now, the population is increasing in this period as well. So the population around 1540 is about 10,000. By 1560, it's 20,000. So the population does go up significantly, but not sufficiently that it can explain the explosion in torture. And then the population does go down to about 15,000. So there is, I really need to amplify this graph and include that, or even do the calculations that would make that more visible. But population growth does not explain what's happening here. You can see that the orange category is quite large in the early 1560s. And when I say moral, I mean adultery, incest, sodomy, blasphemy, heresy, witchcraft, okay, those kinds of crimes. So you can see that it's quite a large percentage. And in fact, I've looked at all the executions that actually took place between 1560 and 1562, and there are 36 that I've been able to find, and half of them are for these moral kinds of sins, so witchcraft, then sexual sins, blasphemy. So there's clearly a lot of interest there. Now, when I showed this graph a couple of years ago at the University of Toronto, someone said, but what percentage of theft trials use torture, and what percentage of witchcraft trials use torture? I want to know more. And I said, well, I can give you a rough, off the cuff, not very many of the theft cases, because often theft cases where someone's stealing a loaf of bread, and you're not going to get tortured for that. And most of the witchcraft cases, like, no, you need to know. And this person had, I don't know who this person was. It was someone who was at a seminar like this kind of context. Said, no, but you need to count. And it may also have to do that my current partner is a quantitative linguist. So I would say things like, should I go into, he wouldn't say anything, but the implicit was yes. So I embarked upon what may have been a foolish venture, but to count a year, so 1650, 1620, 1560, and 1540. I just recently finished the 1560, and it was really striking. So I've discovered that in 1560, there were 676 criminals convicted out of a population of 20,000 in 1 year. That's a lot. If you assume that half that population are youth, that's a lot of people. And unfortunately, I had a bit of a mishap with my computer yesterday. Left it in the Toronto airport. And so I had to reconstruct this presentation for you on the fly. And the next slide I was going to show you was the table that I've actually created of these 676. And you can imagine how long this took to count. And I couldn't offload it onto a graduate student because the paleography was too hard. And a lot of them are for moral and spiritual infractions. So dancing and fornication, but also going to mass outside of the city and making trouble during the service, blasphemy, and then, of course, the more serious sex crimes like adultery and incest and witchcraft. So of those 676 people, 120 of them were banished. But almost 250 of them were just sent to jail for 1 to 3 days. Right? So a huge range. And of all of them, only 20 of them were tortured. So that is kind of interesting. I hope it's interesting enough to spend the time that I spent on it. But I decided that that I need to write an article actually about it to engage with the historiography which is dominant about Reformation Geneva right now, which implies that the consistory is a benign institution that's just about spiritual education. Many of these people, or enforced counseling, Jeff Watt, the companion to Reformation, use that phrase yet again, an enforced counseling service. I don't know any counseling service that sends you on to be criminally prosecuted for what you've done. And the experience of going to consistory was deeply, deeply shaming. So I'm going to use these numbers to say we've got to let go of the enforced counseling narrative. That the consistory, particularly in the late 1550s and the 1560s, was a penal institution, and it was forwarding hundreds of people a year to the criminal court, where they might get only 1 to 3 days in prison or a fine. But still, that's pretty heavy for having gone to mass outside the city. Anyway, you can see you can go down rabbit holes with counting. So I think that's as much a warning as anything else. All right. So the book with the current title, I'm interested to hear what you think. From Truth to Punishment, The Decline of Judicial Torture in Europe, 1550 to 1750. And each chapter, as you know, having read the first one now, is organized around a single trial. So I think it is a form of microhistory. However, Tom Cohen, whose work you may know from Words and Deeds in Renaissance Rome, says it's not. So I would be interested to know your opinion. So as soon as you put any numbers in, it's no longer microhistory. I'm not sure quite what the criteria is. So each chapter follows the same kind of model as the chapter that you have read. That is to say, it's the story of one trial, but that trial is set into a broader context within Geneva, and also a broader context within a European framework. And each chapter has an argument to make about how torture progressed or changed during the 16th and 17th centuries. So the main argument that I'm seeking to make in chapter 1, so if it's not there, you should let me know, is that the will to execute drives practice of torture, rather than the adoption of Roman law. The sort of Langbein thesis, which many people have softened and made less Whiggish, but still I would say is a very dominant narrative when people thinking about the decline of torture. It talks about once you've got Roman law in place, there's this imperative to torture because you can't have a full proof unless you have that confession. And you need that confession, you need that full proof before you can execute. And what I'm finding is that's not true, that that argument that in the 16th century that you need to have a confession to execute is just not sustainable. So the kind of nice narrative that he creates of sort of linear progress, messy but linear progress, really isn't sustainable any longer. And that's because there's more and more people who are actually looking at the practice rather than looking at the law and what the law seems to dictate. So that's the purpose of the first chapter. The second chapter is a blasphemy trial in 1561, where a former monk who converts to the Reformed faith comes to Geneva and thinks that he's going to be able to get approval to go back to France as a pastor. And instead he gets prosecuted for blasphemy, for sex crimes, and also for ostensibly plotting to poison his lover's husband. They're never actually able to prove that one at all, but it's part of what makes him seem like such a horrible character. So that chapter I talk about the aggressive prosecution of sin. So the graph on the previous slide where you see this peak, and the peak is because there's so many moral crimes, if you will, so many sins that are being prosecuted as crimes and resulting in torture and execution. I make an argument that he ends up being executed, and I make an argument that he would not have been executed in 1550 in Geneva. He would not have been executed in 1575 in Geneva. And he certainly wouldn't have been executed anywhere else. That he would have been banished. Not very many places would have wanted him. He had already been banished from Lausanne, in fact. But to go so far as to execute, to have to make that dramatic call was something particular to Geneva at that particular moment. Chapter 3 is a witchcraft trial from the early 17th century. Geneva was very aggressive in prosecuting witchcraft. It's estimated about 300 witches were prosecuted, which is a healthy number. But a relatively low execution rate, and many, many people were banished, and some people were actually liberated. And sometimes torture was used in a purgative way. That is to say, you were tortured 3 times, and you affirm your innocence 3 times. Sometimes you were let go. And William Moncha wrote about this in the 70s, and he argued that it was because of Calvinism and its reasonableness or something like that. just not very satisfying. I mean, he puts it in the last paragraph. Why did it happen? I don't know. It's Calvinism. What I think it is instead is that in Geneva, witchcraft is not treated as an exceptional crime. Witches are tortured, and they're tortured once, twice, 3 times, sometimes more. But they're tortured very much in the same way that recidivist bandits and thieves that plot things at night. Other major serious crimes are tortured in very much the same way. So it's not an exceptional crime that justifies excessive torture. And when someone refuses to confess, there's a mitigated sentence where the person is liberated. More often a mitigated sentence, most commonly banishment. And so Nicolas Delarme, who is a woman accused of witchcraft in 1609, is my one person who doesn't get executed in the book. So I sort of like that. Chapter 4 is an adultery trial in 1645, so I'm kind of moving forward in time. And another Nicolas Boeuf, is accused of serial adultery and of spreading syphilis throughout the city. And she denies it repeatedly. She's tortured several times. And here I really see that medical evidence and torture converge in a sort of escalating way. There have been historians, not so much Langbein, he did not make this argument, but people in a Langbein-esque way, people like Michel Porret in Geneva, argue that the modernization of justice, it was necessary for medical experts to become more important in justice, and medical experts being rational and modernized justice. And of course, anyone who's actually looked at medical experts before 1700, that explodes very quickly, but it's still being said. And so really what happens often is that medical evidence and torture go hand in hand, and they can actually kind of escalate things. So because they discover she has syphilis, that means she's not just an adulteress, but she's also spreading disease. And so that justifies the use of torture again and again and again. I found this also in some rape trials in the 16th century, where again, evidence of a girl being deflowered then justifies the torturing of the accused rapist multiple times. So that's an argument about how medical evidence and torture can work together to lead to an execution. And then chapter 5, which is the late 17th century trial of a servant, or I'll just call him a servant, who steals a large amount from his master. Is to talk about the persistence of torture in the 17th and 18th centuries. Because of course, even though it declines in the 17th century, it's not outlawed until the 18th. And it was still used from time to time for really important cases. Really egregious theft, treason, sedition, sure, infanticide in some cases, right? So it's just that the number of crimes for which they were willing to use torture starts to shrink. Because by the end of the 17th century, certainly my chapter 2 guy would not have been executed. He might not even have been banished. The adultery case, she was the very last adulteress to be executed. You're not executing for adultery by the end of the 17th century. The number of moral crimes, and I know that's problematic categorization, that you're willing to torture and execute for is shrinking. The last witch is executed in 1653 in Geneva. And in all of this, Geneva is not atypical. So there are many other parts of Europe where you're no longer going to execute someone for adultery, for incest, blasphemy by the end, unless very, very exceptional circumstances. Francesca Lotz has done interesting work on Zurich, and by the end of the 17th century, she said, you have to have done it 40 times to get to that kind of prosecution, whereas in the 16th century, you just need to do it once, and you would have a serious trial on your hands. So things are changing, and the range of crimes for which torture and execution are deemed necessary are narrowing, but it still does persist. And I think that's why some people get hung up on the 18th century as the time of transformation. Mostly they're people who don't study the earlier period, but that narrative is still out there too, that it's the Enlightenment that makes torture decline. And I love this trial also because in that trial he withstands torture repeatedly, and they're convinced that he has a charm on him that allows him to not feel pain. It's like a magical charm at the end of the 17th century. Beautiful. So, I think the categories, it's difficult to make that, from 1500 to 1700, that judges are really seeing evidence differently. I see continuity. What I see is changing is this will to execute. The will to execute is becoming less imperative. So instead of executing someone, you banish them, or you flog them. You punish them, for sure, but you don't need to necessarily kill them. So the overall argument, then, is that I'm challenging the historiography, and this is what I'm claiming. It's not because of the Enlightenment, which anyone who studies before 1700 knows. We've got many, many studies that show that the decline in torture and execution is in the 17th century. It's not because of decreasing violence in European society. It's, again, too late. It's happening in the first half of the 17th century across Western Europe. It's happening with the Inquisitions by the early 17th century. So not that those things are completely irrelevant, right? Certainly the abolition has to do with the Enlightenment, right? But they can't really explain why this decline is first generated. It's not only because of appeals courts, regulation, university-educated judges. I don't want to dismiss those, but one of my objectives was to try and make that neat French story apply to more of Western Europe, where you don't have centralized states, in German imperial cities, where for most part you don't have appeals courts, where the judges are, like in Geneva, not university trained. And it's not because of changes in the evidence judges consider valid. So this question of the rising use of medical experts, that you're willing to execute suddenly at the end of the 17th century claims lying by without a full confession, just using circumstantial evidence. That's happening in the early 16th century too. So the evidence of actual practice does not sustain, and I'm focusing on Geneva, and most of my examples are coming from Geneva, but the secondary literature that I've read in other places doesn't contradict this. What I'm finding is surprising, really. So instead, what I'm positing is that torture declined because the will to execute narrowed to public order crimes. That is to say, instead of thinking of torture driving execution, and what is the criteria for using torture, then that is what leads to an execution. I think it's the reverse. That it's a will to execute. In this case, this person, having committed this heinous crime, is such a threat to our community that we need to prosecute this to the full extent of the law. Hence, we will use torture. Rather, this person, well, we could just banish them. And if we banish them, we don't need a full proof. And hence, we probably don't need to torture them. Or maybe we'll torture them once and see what they say. And then if they still deny it, we'll still banish them. Yeah, right? So this will to execute is uneven, it's not linear. It tends to increase in communities during times of political stress, during times of religious stress. So in many places, the 16th century is the peak of judicial torture in Western Europe. But not everywhere, it depends. But you can often see patterns, some patterns that I alluded to in the first chapter, places like Bologna and Florence, where there's an explosion of torture and execution at moments of political stress, when regime change is happening. And it goes on for a couple decades, and then it subsides. So it's not linear. And so what we really need to be looking at is what kinds of strains are communities under that lead them to believe that the will to execute is where they have to go. Because I think with torture, none of these judges are naive about torture. None of these judges think that a false confession is impossible. There are too many safeguards that come from Roman law that you have someone confess again 24 hours later, for example. It's built into the system. There's skepticism built into the system. All of them know that torture can be abusive. The way I think about it is there's a scale. So there's the scale on one side is torture could be abusive, torture might produce a false confession. That would say maybe we shouldn't use it. Wow, but we've got a lot of witches around. Or, we've got to get rid of those troublesome people and establish a monopoly so that we can have more stable government. And it just tips it a little bit. Tips it just a little so that they're more willing to use it. As I say, these are contexts in which really there's very little change in the law. So we're looking at people interpreting the law differently as circumstances dictate. The other thing I think that's going on is the desacralization of pain. So when you're thinking about the 15th century and in Europe, pain can be salvific in Catholic Europe. And it was often framed in that way. And instead, in French, sometimes the word confession is used instead of aveu, which indicates that sort of that it's not an entirely always secular phenomenon where you're being tortured, even if it's a secular court of law. That's the argument I made in my rights of torture argument. By the 17th century, especially by the second half of the 17th century, this conception of pain as salvific, or pain as something can bring you closer to God, is starting to wane. It never goes away, but it's starting to wane. And this can be seen in both Catholic and Protestant areas. Protestants, even though they abandoned the hair shirts, abandoned the flagellation, there's still real valorization of pain in the early 17th century, which a number of scholars have established that even for the Protestants, pain is very, very important. And it becomes less so by the end of the 17th century for most groups. So what we see happening in the 17th century is people start talking about pain differently and using pain differently. So I've come across wonderful details in the Parlement Bordeaux where the magistrates are trying to decide what punishment to impose on a particular criminal. And they said, well, torture is one of the worst forms of punishment. It's not supposed to be punishment, right? It's supposed to be truth-telling. But they're starting to think about it that way. There are important texts by Friedrich von Spee and Johann Weyer who start saying, what we're doing to these vulnerable old women is abusive. So not that no one had thought about torture as abusive before. It's built into the system. When the Inquisition, when the papacy started using the Inquisition in the 13th century, they said, don't break anybody's arms and legs, that's not good, but try and get them to confess that they're heretic. There was always an awareness, the way that torture has been used from the 13th century on, that it could be abusive. And that's why there are all these safeguards, where you had to get the confession again 24 hours later, where you weren't supposed to use it too many times, where you're supposed to get all the other evidence, gather all the other evidence before you go to torture. But the dial is turned up on the abuse rhetoric in the 17th century. And we also see torture starting to be used like punishment. In France, la question préparatoire declines significantly by the end of the 16th century. By 1600, it's not used very much. But the question préalable, which happens after sentencing, So after the person has been deemed to be guilty, then you can torture them to find out who their accomplices are. So torture starts to become actually part of the punishment process. It's not technically, it's still part of the court proceeding, but it starts being used more and more in that way. And so there's been interesting work done on, say, Brittany to show that the question préparatoire was ceased to be used, but that préalable still sticks around, and that's true for much of France. We see the shift. And in Geneva too, we see them starting to give estrapade or strappado as a form of punishment in the 17th century. Occasionally, it's not commonplace, but it does come up from time to time, which never I saw in that earlier decades, where it was clearly something distinct, something about truth-telling, earlier on in the investigative process, trying to get that confession, and not so much about punishment. So it seems that pain is being thought of in a different way in the 17th century, and it's harder and harder to justify it as not abusive. By the 17th century. So that is what I have to say. And I would like to hear from you. So thank you.
So we'll shift our prospects, since I didn't have you all introduce yourself at the start. Since we were introducing Max Award, so now why don't you start us off and go around.
I'm Natalie Donnell. I'm a first-year PhD student. I work with Professor Collins, and I work on royal and noble women musicians.
Yeah, he's telling me about your project. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay. Hi.
I'm Beik. I'm a first-year PhD student. I work on Geneva in South Asia, particularly touching questions.
I'm Susan Naramore. I'm a second-year master's student, and I'm interested in the intersection of politics and art in early modern Europe, particularly in Florence.
I'm Jacob Burnham. I'm a third-year PhD student who works on France and their relations with South Asia.
Okay. In what era?
The 17th and 16th centuries. Yeah.
I'm Scott Chan. I'm a 5th-year PhD student. I'm working on tolerance in the 17th century France.
I'm Lee Stevens, a second-year PhD student working with Professor Collins on language and violence during French Revolution.
I'm Ashley Corwin. I'm finishing up my dissertation
Oh,
on blasphemy.
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic.
Nathan Markowitz.
We've met before.
Yeah, we had the
Yes.
RSA a year ago, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm working on Franco-Ottoman diplomacy at George Mason University under Matt Qualt as a 5th-year PhD student.
I'm Tom Adams, and I'm retired from NEH, and I've been working on Europe's welfare traditions.
Oh, fantastic.
You may remember Tom from the Ocean region?
Yeah, I do. You look familiar too. Yeah. And I thought, well, if you were doing NEH, I couldn't. But it was you. Yeah, so nice to see you again. Yeah.
And I'm Mac.
He's back, and I know you.
Awesome.
I'm Tommaso Serina, teacher of the modern
We're going to ask you about the micro-history question. So
Yeah.
we have an expert here on the room.
Yes, I very much appreciate your contribution.
I'm Brenna Cameron Steinke. I'm a first-year PhD student here, and I study medieval environmental history.
I'm Matt Claude. I'm a master's student. I study modern German economic history.
I'm Said Kaymakçı. I'm working on Ottoman debates of military reform and how to establish discipline and order with Professor Agoston, and also on 17th and 18th centuries.
Fantastic. Great.
Gabriel Agoston, Ottoman history, Ottoman, Euro, Balkans, military, economic, social.
No, thank you for coming.
Elizabeth Cross. I work on France and its empire and political economy in the 18th century.
I've known you forever.
Yeah. Negotiation. And
George, French linguistics.
you look familiar too.
Yeah.
No.
No.
All right. So,
All right.
do you want to, actually, I'm curious, because she raised the question of.
I thought this looked like microhistory to me.
What exactly is the argument that's not?
That's all we needed to
If
hear.
you count, it's not microhistory, or what was it?
I don't know. He didn't tell me
This is
why.
your
I guess I told him that I was doing the trials, but then I was also putting in some quantitative stuff to context. And he goes, "Well, then you're not doing microhistory." And I just thought, I don't want to contest that right now. You know, so it's just sort of a conversation stopper rather than.
Tom is a man of opinions.
He's a man of opinions, and he's lovely, and
Yes.
he's incredibly supportive. So I'm not. Yeah. Yes.
I had a sort of a factual quick question and then a one about the jurisprudence. So one is my own ignorance. So Geneva moved out of Savoy, which I knew, and I know Switzerland moves formally out of the empire in 1648. Does Geneva become part of the Swiss Confederation? No, so
No, not until much
Much
later,
later, okay.
like 19th century. Yeah.
the jurisprudential question was, I remember, I mean, I haven't worked on this for 20 years, but I remember vaguely that at least in Italy, some of the jurisprudence suggested that torture was in fact a bit of a gamble for the judge because technically if you withstood torture a certain number of times, you actually purged the evidence, and so literally they had to start from scratch. Now they didn't always follow that to the letter, but there was actually an element of, and so I was curious, first of all, if that came up in your cases, but also more broadly, because of what you told us about Geneva, I was wondering, I realize these are not professional lawyers, as you said, but what jurisprudence do they refer to if they think about jurisprudence? They must have some sort of reference to jurisprudential authorities, and I'm just curious where they're looking.
Yeah, so what was the first one again? Sorry.
Whether the resistance to torture purges the evidence.
Yeah. So, so that principle that if you resist torture repeatedly, that all other evidence will be purged, and that only means that the trial is
basically gone.
Is gone, and you let the person go, is not very common, but it does occur, and it does occur in the late 16th century in France for sure, and some of the Parlement, not often. Bernard Schneider's work on Bordeaux and Paris, Parlement Paris has shown that. And it does happen in Geneva too. So at the height of the witchcraft trials, which were in the 1560s, there are a small minority of mostly women, but also men, who were tortured and they refused to confess, and they were liberated, and so it was purged. No evidence of that happening in the 17th century, and no evidence that I know of it happening in the 17th century in France either. It does seem, I've heard, now I'm going to forget where I read this, but someone said that, that sort of literal interpretation of torture, and that extreme weighting of torture over all other evidence was no longer considered good practice by the 17th century. So it's still very important, but it's not going to obey everything else. And then in terms of the jurisprudence, the city councillors don't really. But what they do is turn to these university-trained lawyers, these Frenchmen who have immigrated. And starting in about 1550, we see more and more of these legal briefs, and there are hundreds of them for the late 16th century. And they're so wonderful because they do give you a sense. Now, the city councillors were not obligated to follow the advice of these lawyers, and often they didn't. So we can't see it as an exact mirror of what the judges were thinking. But even that disparity between what the legal brief says, oh, you should definitely torture this person repeatedly, you should definitely execute this person, and then them not doing it, is revealing. So having the legal briefs is really wonderful. And certainly, they do refer. They refer to not the law, not the Carolina, because Geneva was refusing to acknowledge any authority there. They refer to the Justinian Code. They refer to Roman law, to the traditions of Roman law, quite frequently. In terms of actual legislation in Geneva, I think I talk about it in this chapter. It's very, very sparse. It's just really a few sentences, very late. So 1568, we have that you torture if the person refuses to confess if it's a serious crime, and the council has to approve it. But no mention of methods, no mention of how many times. It's very, very sparse. So we're in a situation where there's a huge amount of judicial discretion. And you could imagine they would continue to use it until it's abolished in 1738. But in fact, that's not what happens. So that's what's so interesting is there's really no oversight. There's no regulation. There's no appeals court telling them what to do. After 1600, these university-trained lawyer briefs cease. So it's really the council doing what it thinks is right. And what it thinks is right is to use torture less and less, and to use the strapato less and less. So by 1650, that's why I hate graphs actually, so I'm still culturally sorry. It's because it hides all kinds of nuance. So what's hidden by that graph is the fact that in the 1560s, they were using the strapato quite regularly, and that by what counted as torture by the 1650s was attaching it to the instruments. So it doesn't give you that nuance. And as you saw, those of you who had a chance to read the chapter, I have this question mark percentage. And the reason is because I originally categorized them in terms of heavy, moderate, and light torture, and now I need to go back and recategorize everyone as like how many sessions. Because you can have several sessions and still be light. In other words, the first time you're just taken and they attach you, and the second time they threaten to attach you, but they don't actually touch you, and then in between they put you in a stress position, and then the third time you confess without any torture being applied. So I would still call that light, even though it's over several sessions. And so I still have to do those calculations, and I realized in the frenzied time before I sent it to you that wasn't going to happen. But trust me, that the percentage of confessions does go up as the number of applications. Essentially what I find is almost anyone can resist torture once. There's a very strong motivation. You know, if it's a serious enough crime in Geneva, you know that you're likely to be executed if you confess. So you have a very strong incentive not to, and to withstand the torture, whether you're guilty or not. Of course, we never know in any of these cases for sure whether they were or not. By the time it gets to 3, and it becomes clear that there's no maximum of 3, and this could go on, you get a lot of people saying, I will say whatever you want. Just tell me what to say, I will deliver it, I want this to end. But of course, the judges say, we can't do that, we need you to confess specific details that are consistent with our circumstantial evidence. Psychologically, they're broken. And you can see that, and then the confessions come fast and furious. And they often have been able to glean enough of the circumstantial evidence from the leading questions that have been asked in the previous interrogations. So if you get to 3 or 4 sessions of torture, and they're not just being attached to the instrument, but actually having pain applied, many people do. I'm letting Jim do it.
I have 2 questions. Hopefully the first will be a bit shorter. But were there professional torturers? Like, who would be the, especially, I mean, people who are able to determine how much torture to use and what's appropriate and when?
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. That's a great question. And that should be in chapter 1. So thank you. So there was an executioner. And so we're looking at a fairly small polity, so we don't need multiple officers. So there's an executioner at any given time, and it's the executioner who does it, but never alone. So they're always in the presence of at least a couple of members of the small council, the city council. So they're also present. And technically, a medical professional is supposed to be present as well, but I do not see evidence of that. In other words, in many of the torture sessions, they actually list all the people who were present. It's amazing. And then I can, like as you saw in that chapter, I was able to say who they were, and what kind of vested interest they might have had in the case. And I don't see medical officers in most cases, although they were occasionally brought in.
Was it like a passed down? How do you get the job of being an executioner?
Well,
did they teach other people?
So there's been some great work
Joel
on
Harrington's book.
Joel Harrington's book, but also earlier Kathy Stewart's book.
Kathy Stewart's book too. Yeah.
On executions, she made a really interesting argument that, and that's sustained by Joel also, that there are actually, in the German world, that there are kind of clans of executioners who can only kind of marry each other.
Families.
So you can marry the cousin that's
It's a very dishonorable role, so
Kind of
that's
a
something that
caste.
stays
Kind
in
of a caste.
Yeah.
But in Geneva, I have very fragmented evidence about who the executioner is, but I have had a couple of instances of you committed a horrible crime, major theft. Why don't you become our executioner?
Wow.
Yeah, I'm like, great. Fantastic. Yeah, that's all I really know that I've found myself about the executioners. So it's hard for me to, their names are not mentioned. I do not have, as some other places, the only record they have is torture, is what the executioner was paid. I have no records of how much the executioner was paid. I have legislation that says they should be paid this much, but I have no records, financial records that I've found yet that indicate the payments.
Can I just say something to that actually that's interesting about the executioner offers person doing torture, and we have some cases that are really kind of poignant of witchcraft cases that I know the best, of that a woman was, tortured and tortured and tortured, she finally is going to be killed, and they're going to have somebody else kill her, and she says, no, it has to be the person who was torturing me. I now have this relationship with him, and and they often are imprisoned with the executioner, so that's the person who is there, and that they build this, and it's Stockholm syndrome of some kind of that, but they build this relationship, and that she wanted to be killed by him, which is just bizarre psychologically in so many ways. But you would build up this very close relationship to this person who would be the person giving you the pain, but also taking it away and stopping it.
Exactly. That's right. Also
Yeah, what you mentioned is also true in France, about we were just talking about the Sanson family in Paris, but in many other places, if there was an executioner, which there weren't that many cities that had a regular executioner, I remember correctly that most guilds had statutes that you were not allowed to marry executioners' children. And usually it was only the blood trades, the butchers
Yeah,
and the
exactly.
tanners,
So all
who were allowed, and most of them also had regulations against marrying into butchers and tanners.
yeah, so it's similar.
Was the guy in the Chalet conspiracy out in Nantes? I sort of have a vague recollection in 1626, because when there's a conspiracy that involves César de Vendôme and probably Gaston and a whole bunch of other people against Louis XIII, and the key guy is Chalet, of course. And they're going to execute him out in Nantes, and his friends kidnapped the executioner. And if I remember correctly, that they first talk about a guy who's sort of on death row, and they'll let him off if he'll do the deed. And they then do that, and then they hire a guy who doesn't know how to do it properly, and he whacks him 6 or 7 times, and he doesn't die, and the whole thing is a horrible mess, and it scandalizes everybody. But they thought by kidnapping the executioner,
They could prevent the execution.
They could prevent the execution.
Instead, they just made it into a horrible
Yeah.
way of torture.
But you mentioned that in your particular case, that the guy might have strangled them. So in a way, it does matter who it is. A compassionate executioner will strangle him before
Could
he
make
burns
any
him.
difference. I have no evidence in this particular case that he did, but we know that that was not an uncommon practice.
Normally in France, if you were burned, you were killed first.
Yeah.
Joan of Arc and things, there are a few other exceptions, but most of the time you were killed first.
Ashley had another question.
Oh, Ashley.
Yeah, right, sorry, because I interrupted, derailed it.
Right. So that was the quick question.
Yes, sorry. So, I don't know if you found cases of people who confessed right off the bat without torture, and could they gain clemency or leniency?
It depended. So it depended. So let's take a crime like theft, which is so variable, and it's not about how expensive the thing that was stolen is. It has a lot to do with repentance. So if you stole something quite significant from your mistress or your master, so it's a major violation of their trust. If they believed you, they would sometimes say, yeah, you can see that there's sort of a negotiation in the background. The criminal sentence is maybe a flogging or time in the pillory, and then you go back into service with them. So for some crimes, admitting it could be hugely advantageous. And a lot of people do come in and admit the crimes right off the bat, especially like that where there's this real possibility of mitigation. Blasphemy as well. If you came in and you said, I'm really sorry, I don't know what I was doing, I won't do it again, that could be very successful. It wasn't successful for certain crimes at all. So murder or incest or adultery in this period anyway. Those are just going to take you to the scaffold quicker. So it really depended.
I have 2 questions. One is about okay, you look into statistics now, you calculate, but what about the qualitative? Are there any discourses on the torture, any treatises, just discussing what to do and what kind of methods would bring the order best? Because in the Ottoman context, for example, the discussions, the literary discussions are about how to bring discipline and order to the society and to the army, and whether we should be compassionate or just strict and apply heavy sentences and so on. So are there any discussions about this among the intelligentsia or other people in the city and around? And second, how does this connect to the military kind of discipline and punishments and criminal system? Are there is there a separate military criminal system? Because in Foucault and others, we know that the rise of this discipline and punish and order in Europe is kind of also connected to military discipline and military ordinances. So there might be some just links between the two. So the decline of torture might be also about for example, I don't know, taking people into army, conscripting them, and now they are more disciplined and they don't just they don't need these kind of heavy forms of torture to be confessed. So I'm just asking
So in terms of the literary sources, and of course when I started this project I was very interested in thinking about what are the jurists saying, what are the crime pamphlets saying, what is the larger discourse about torture. And there's not a whole lot. That's what I found was that there in the popular sort of forums there's lots of discussion of execution but very little discussion of torture because it's happening behind closed doors and so it's sort of secret. In terms of the jurists, their discussions of torture are incredibly, to my mind, as I was reading them, unhelpful. This is the law, this is what you should do, but very little discussion of why. Very little discussion of why it would be important to do it in this case and not in that case, which is what I was hoping for. I was wanting that, and I couldn't find it. I also think it's a little bit problematic to assume that what's going on in France is what's going on in Geneva, without denying that there's obviously a strong influence. Right? Geneva is very, very close to France. It's got a large immigrant population that comes in the middle of the 16th century. That immigrant population, many of them leave, but the others stay and are integrated. And throughout the 17th century, you can see that Geneva is increasingly in that sort of French cultural orbit. But I do think it's still problematic to say, oh, this stuff was being said in France, hence we should just assume that's the way it was in Geneva. And Geneva had no intelligentsia. Someone in the 17th century. Seriously. So there was nothing was being published. There are no memoirs of notable families that I can really draw on. There's some chronicles of what happened during the Reformation, but it's incredibly dry for those kinds of sources. So again, this is part of the way I've stopped being a literary cultural historian for this project. Anyway, I've become this archival hound. Because I wasn't finding sources I felt comfortable using. People have done this, have used French sources and then just applied them to Geneva. And I guess I just find that a little bit problematic. To just do it without any sort of complication of how would we even know if these texts were being read and were they influencing. Certainly by the 18th century, we're seeing a lot of interpenetration. But this change is happening well before that. It's happening before 1650, before I think a lot of that's really getting going. Unfortunately, I think a lot of these conversations are happening in back rooms and happening in documents that are, happening orally and are not documented. I'm sure there were conversations happening, but I haven't, I haven't had that smoking gun. It's like a judge in one town going to another town saying, "So I was having over dinner. We had a conversation about what is torture anyway, and why do we do it? I'm looking for it, but I haven't found that." In terms of the intersection with the military. In the Genevan context, that doesn't really come up. There's a night watch, so they have a defense in the city, and members of the night watch are regularly being disciplined for missing their shifts or being drunk on their shifts or falling asleep during their shifts. But actually, they're punished very leniently because they need them on the night watch. It's clear there are only certain people who want to work on the night watch, and most bourgeois and elite are buying it off, and they're not actually serving. So it's sort of this underclass of characters who might be good executioners, who are working the night watch, and they kind of want them to behave, but they actually don't want them to take off. So they're actually pretty lenient with them. So that's the only sort of disciplining of soldiers that I see. Now, of course, there are, obviously Switzerland, overall, Swiss territories are a major source of mercenaries. But I don't have a lot of evidence of that from my sources. By the 17th century, Geneva is increasingly a good place to be economically after 1650. And there's burgeoning silk industry, there's the starting of the clockmaking industry. Things are looking better, and so there's less of an incentive to leave. And I don't have any evidence of large numbers of people leaving Genevan territory to go to the wars and be mercenaries, and no evidence at all of people coming back as having been mercenaries and then being treated differently, which I find interesting because I have a colleague, Karina Johnson, who works on German cities, and there's a lot of that. There's a lot of, sending you off to the war against the Turks if as a punishment. But also sort of regulating those people when they come back slightly differently. So she can see traces in the archives of these people who go off to the wars. I see much, much less of that. All that I've really seen recently, when I did this survey of every single criminal in 1560, I did come across a few who were accused of being part of the conspiracy of Amboise in France. And one person who was accused of having manufactured gunpowder for the wars. And again, treated very variously. So this one guy, Jean Chaton, who actually loses his life for having repeatedly been caught for having manufacturing gunpowder, ostensibly for French use, which it probably was. But there were several people who came back who clearly had participated in the wars on the Huguenot side, and they were wrapped over the knuckles. So I think that will be addressed possibly Phil Benedict is coming out with a new book about the conspiracy of was, and in which he makes the argument that Geneva was much more implicated in it than we previously thought. And I think that the lenient treatment of the men, they had to be wrapped up in the knuckles. They're in the archive, but they're treated very, very leniently. So in Geneva, I don't see that. But that doesn't mean that if I'm saying there's some kind of cultural miasma that's sort of circulating somehow in conversations of which we have no record, then it doesn't mean it's irrelevant, right? Because there may be other places that are very much engaged in raising armies, disciplining armies, who are thinking along the same lines, right? So it's just you can't make a direct argument in Geneva. So I wouldn't dismiss that out of hand. I just don't have direct evidence of it.
Before we get to the thing I'm going to ask a question, it's sort of related to that. And my question is about, which is irrelevant, I would say, in this chapter, but just sort of larger curiosity. Soldiers regularly tortured people. There's a whole informal economy of torture, and they use a whole series of techniques that clearly are not part of the official canon of torturing, right? And perhaps they're more effective, right? In getting peasants to tell where they've hidden whatever it is they're torturing to find out about. What is the relationship between those kind of informal modes of torture, which people may have heard are actually more effective, but are not really recognized as a legal form of torture? You sort of lay it out that there's a very specific group of torture practices that are accepted as legal, and the idea of just kind of arbitrarily torturing people
creative and interesting ways
is
not
really,
considered legitimate.
it's not considered legitimate.
That's an abuse of power.
Right.
So I think that it's clear that the only reason that the jurists say, who say yes, torture is justified in these particular circumstances is because it's constrained by law, because it's constrained by these procedures. So that's why I say that it's built into the DNA of torture in the early modern period, that it's inherently abusive. Because that's why they contain it in so many ways. And that's what's interesting in Geneva. They don't have to use specific procedures. There's nothing in their local law. They could use any kind of method that they want, but they use very conventional procedures that are used in other nearby polities. So I think it's because there's always the possibility that could be abuse. And what soldiers are doing is obviously that. And they want to distinguish themselves from that, and they're doing an honorable and rational and reasonable pursuit of truth. Which may be a gamble, because sometimes people don't confess.
Dale, you had your hand before when you and Mac, and then I'll get to the others. But I saw you two. You were in my queue after Saeed, and then Mac, and then we'll go to other.
This is a quick question. I enjoyed reading your chapter. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you about. So I saw that you had a lot of data on your judges, like especially the class location. So I just wanted to know whether you found it in the archive or what you did to get that kind of data. What the strategies you employed to get this data.
Well, I was very reliant on Bill Nafy's work. If you see, I think I cite Bill Nafy more than anyone else. His Calvin the Consolidation of the Reformation in Geneva was absolutely seminal. So he's looking at it from, how did Calvin come to dominate? How did his party come to dominate? And what were the political machinations that were counted? So a lot of those people he found. But I also found them as well, and fighting with each other, being brought before the criminal court, being brought before the consistory for fighting. So I didn't do a huge amount of looking in the notary archives, although I did do a little and I found things. But ultimately, I have enough. Like, I don't need to do a biography of each one of these guys. So the main strategy, if I wanted to further my investigation, would be notary records, of which there are ample, this very ample supply in Geneva, and fairly well cataloged, so you can sort of find your way around them not too difficultly. That's the decent thing to do. Not only the records very rich, but they also catalog them. Though I did very much appreciate, there was one time someone who knocked, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "What are you doing here? And who are you? Why are you looking at these records?" And it turned out he was an amateur historian, Bernard Lescas, who I cite heavily. He's actually written some really good articles. And he was the one who told me there's a register of all the crimes, a 19th century register, in very nice hand, of not all the trials and not all the criminals, but all the ones that survived, which is a minority, 20 to 50% survive in a given year. They have this beautiful 19th century register, and some of them mention that torture is used. So he taps me on the shoulder and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm looking at torture." And he said, "You know, most of the uses of torture are not mentioned in the register. And I was like, oh, darn. In fact, I think I might have said something stronger. I thought, that means I have to look at every single case that survives to see. But thank goodness he gave me that tip. And so I did. So I started looking through, I've looked through hundreds and hundreds of cases, and I am such an expert of saying, okay, this is the point, they're going to make the decision, is it going to be torture or not, this is the, it was great practice. It was great. I feel like I am sometimes in the brains of these 16th century judges. I know what they're going to do. I can see the trial going in different directions. I know what they're going to ask, and I know when they're going to come to that point where they say, is it worth our time and our money to torture this person, or should we just get them out of town? So that wasn't really what you were asking. Sorry, I got kind of on a tangent.
Mac, you were next in the queue.
Couple of comments. I got the impression in reading your chapter, and even more so in hearing you talk about the rest of the book, that something else was going on besides the decline of the will to execute, except in public order cases and the sacralization of pain, is that these judges were getting better and better at getting convictions without confessions.
Better and better.
Yeah, they found ways of producing convictions without needing necessarily a confession. So the whole function of torture to get a confession became less necessary.
And that would be a very Langevin sort of argument. And I would say no. They weren't getting any better. I see a small number of these convictions without confession in the 16th century. I see them in the 17th century. The numbers have not gone up. They haven't changed. And they were always really actually quite desperate to get the confession. So in almost all of those cases where someone doesn't confess, but there's so much circumstantial evidence, and they confess to enough things that, that's sufficiently proven, is the term they use. On the scaffold, they have a pastor go and talk to the person. And inevitably, they confess on the scaffold, conveniently. And then the pastor writes up that confession, and it's put in the trial record. They want the confession. They want the confession, because it makes them righteous. And they did just whatever they could to get the confession. Nicolas Boeuf, the adultery case, she won't confess. So they tried that on her before the scaffold. They were like, oh, bring a minister in and see what happens. And she retracts everything to the minister. So that creates, again, that's this risk of torture, the risk of bringing in a minister. The minister's convinced that she made a few mistakes and she's repented. And the minister's like, you should not execute this woman. She's a sinner, but she's come to her senses and she's reconciled with God. That's not what the judges wanted. They tortured her again. She's obstinate, she's stubborn. So I don't see that. I don't see that they're getting better. I see that their criteria for what they want to be able to convict to execute is very similar in 1530 and in 1700. And the subterfuges that they use are the same. I see it as a subterfuge, where they bring the pastor in. I've never seen one of those pastor reports right at the end on the scaffold where they're like, yeah, actually they didn't confess, but you killed them anyway. Oh well. They always confess at the last minute. And that confession is not a specific confession. So right now I'm working actually on an infanticide trial, a critical edition of a late 17th century infanticide trial from Geneva for the University of Toronto Press. And it's going to be used, it's going to be a small paperback, translated into English, annotated for pedagogical use. University of Toronto Press has done a couple of other trials. They've done Galileo's trial, and they've done a witch trial, the trial of Temple Annika, which I've used in the classroom, and it's great. Students love it, so I'm doing one at infanticide. And she, should I give it away? She does not confess. They said that they have sufficient evidence. And so on the scaffold, the pastor goes, and she says, oh yeah, I did it. But that confession, unlike all the other confessions that they expect in the legal procedure, wasn't about the specifics of how you did it. Remember I said that sometimes if you would torture 3 times, people say, I'll say whatever you want, and they say, no, you have to give us the specifics. Well, those confessions, those last-minute confessions on the scaffold, can be just like, yeah, I did it. Yeah, I did it. I feel bad. I'm awful. I'm a bad person.
I have a question about this. Yeah. If I saw that, I would assume that they're utterly worthless. if they all say the same thing, there's no possible way that's what's happening.
I agree. And I don't know if this one really killed a kid or not. That's one of the reasons this trial is, I think, going to be really great to teach with, because it's not even included in this particular case the child was killed. Like, the child could have died of natural. I agree with you completely.
Right, and so exactly back to what you were saying before, what it really is telling you about the social and cultural norm they're trying to enforce,
Exactly.
that they're acting justly, and this
Exactly.
is the proof thereof,
Exactly.
in their eyes.
In their eyes. So they're still wanting that confession.
Yeah,
He's not convinced.
What about the will to execute?
Mhm.
Do you explain later in the book, more so than you do in the chapter we read, what causes that? What causes the decline of the will to execute, except in public order cases? Because in some ways, that just sounds like another Whiggish Langbody.
That's interesting. Yes, I think I do. I mean, so the next 3 trials after this one, the blasphemy, the witchcraft, and the adultery, are all these kinds of crimes that they do execute in the late 16th century, early 17th century, and then cease to. And essentially, I do talk about it at length, about how, although these people are still seen to be worthless, and some people you don't want to have in your community, that they're no longer a threat to the, and I don't want to say civic order because that's such a modern term, but to the health of the community. I do think that at the, in the 1560s, for example, there was a real conviction in the small council, in that city council, that they were doing God's will, by punishing these people so visibly, so violently. By the early 17th century, they start with many of these trials for these moral crimes, probably defined. They might torture someone once, and they say, no, I didn't do it, and so they banish them, and leave them to the judgment of God. And there are a lot of these. Banish them, leave them to the judgment of God. And this is not our job to decide. We don't want them around. Definitely, we are sufficiently convinced of their guilt that we do not want them in our community. But do we need to go to the lengths of actually killing them? The sense of the threat that they posed to the health of the community had just sort of diminished. Just like the blasphemy argument, that in 1560, to say something, that could get you killed or certainly banished, which by the 1630s, you would get wrapped over the knuckles and say, you really shouldn't say that. But by that time, Geneva is a confident Protestant place. It's feeling pretty secure in its identity, and not as under threat as it was in, say, 1560. So I think it's about declining threat in terms of religious tension, religious divisions, the threat of heresy, the threat of sin to undermine the community, the health of the community, and that sort of sense of we have responsibility to punish violently, to prove our loyalty to God, and to prove that we are good Christians, I think starts to diminish. And I do talk about it quite a lot, I think. I hope to. I mean, I have. I hope it comes through, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Lee, I saw your hand, and then we'll go to Nathan since he's a visitor. Sort of.
You mentioned in passing in the chapter that the conditions of being held during the investigation can be like a sort of torture on its own. And I was curious if during this period in Geneva there are any changes to the conditions of prisoners, not convicts, but those who are being held during the investigation, either the length they're held or the conditions that they're held in, or if there's anything of that nature that changes.
Yeah, so it's super fragmentary, what we know. But I have done some note counting of how long trials last, and it's, the many are just a day or two, and some, especially in the 1560s, get very long, and I'm going to say a very long mean 3 or 4 months. What we know about the conditions are very fragmentary. What we know from sentencing or from comments that are in the record is that generally it meant a bread and water diet unless your family was able to supplement it, right? So if you had family who could come and bring you food, you were usually allowed to have that, unless there was a particular reason why you weren't. I do know that they were using the stress positions in the prison less by the 17th century, in between interrogations. So that's very, very common. If they don't actually torture you in the interrogations, the using of stress positions, like attaching you to the wall or attaching your feet, was very commonplace. And I don't have evidence of that in the 17th century. They just put you back in prison. So I think it probably was less unpleasant, but unpleasant doesn't do it justice. This would be a horrible, horrible experience. Underheated in the winter, stifling in the summer, And also, when I did my 676 people, 300 of them were imprisoned. This is a penal, so not during trial. The prison must be a lot bigger than I thought it was. I haven't done the calculations, but how many people there would have been every week on average was a lot of people. And so most of these sentences were very, very short, just a few days. But still, they're sending people to prison, and they're holding people who are on trial. There were quite a number of people, but it's also clear that they did have separate spaces within this building. It was a former monastery that they appropriated. So this is after the Reformation. I don't know where the prison was before. I should know, but I don't remember. But there were individual cells as well, because they could isolate prisoners, as they did in this trial. And it's not uncommon when they've got more than one defendant that they do play them off each other in quite clever ways.
Conditions were bad enough that the one in the so-called La Trompette, that there were quite a large number of cases where people who were imprisoned there or held there subsequently developed tuberculosis or other very serious illnesses. And some very prominent people then subsequently died 2 or 3 years later of the condition that they believed, probably rightly, that they had developed in prison. And these are high status people, not the kind of bread and water.
A great book called Enfermement, edited by Julie Klaust and I can't remember, Isabelle, double-barreled last name. But Enfermement, which is it looks at enclosures of people both in the cloister and in the prison from the medieval period, the 8th century to the 18th century, and drawing on literary sources, drawing on archival sources. Wonderful, wonderful collection. Some of the pieces are stronger than others. The early modern pieces are not so strong, but lots of really strong late medieval pieces, which show that even for elite people, the conditions were often very difficult, even when they were allowed to have bedding brought in by their family. And
I've seen other ones where they complain about this insect, mange, and he can't change his linen, and he's covered with all kinds of vermin, and so they're asking.
It was a dangerous place to be. I mean, for a day or two, then that's just punitive, but if you were in there for weeks, that would compromise your health. So the blasphemy trial, it's a 2 or 3 month trial. And they only torture him twice, actually, but they hold him for long periods of time between interrogations. And you can imagine that could drive you crazy, actually, right? You don't know what's coming, you're waiting for weeks, and nobody's even talking to you anymore. And you don't know if this will ever end, or if you're just going to be left to languish. Imagine, that feeling of just being left to languish, and you have no support. This person had no family network, no social network, no people who are coming by and saying hi. It's also clear that there are windows and people were constantly saying hi. And that was another thing the magistrates were trying to use against people. But it's clear that it wasn't a dungeon. Like, it was a space where people could call to you and you could have conversations, or you could have conversations with the jailer. The adulteress has interesting visitors come and visit her.
I bet.
No, not those ones. All of the men in the trial leave town.
Of course. We had one example, somebody coming and talking to the guy, trying to convince him to confess.
Confess, yes, exactly, in that trial as well. Yeah. So,
well, there's all kinds of letters about how Louis XIV has Fouquet treated very badly. He's not allowed to have books, he's not allowed to have regular visitors, his cell is not of the type that somebody... And so there clearly was a sense of...
We're going to soften them up. I do have legal briefs. So these university-trained lawyers are so valuable. I love the legal briefs. There's actually someone who's been working on a dissertation, a PhD thesis in Geneva for a long time now, like 15 years or something, who works only on these legal briefs. And she transcribed them all, like hundreds of them. And it hasn't come out. And people were like, don't step on her toes, she's doing this really important work. I'm like, it's been 15 years. Like, I gotta move on. But I want her to publish it, because the briefs are so rich, there's all kinds of stuff in there. But I have come across, in my perusing of them, statements about, okay, yeah, let's just let them hang out for a couple of weeks, soften them up next time. Probably they'll be able to be a little more cooperative.
But wasn't there a law also in Geneva, I remember this with Calvin and Servetus, that if you accused somebody of a crime, you also had to go to jail while the trial was going on. And like, Calvin pays a student to go for him when he accuses Servetus. And so, I mean,
yeah,
there's a lot of people that
it's a lot of
happen to be
Although,
imprisoned.
I do have some cases where I'm aware of someone denouncing someone else and then having to be essentially collateral, right? But only a handful. Like, so this Raiders case, yes. Actually, my infanticide trial, yes, there's a father. Anyway, it's a complicated trial, but there's someone who comes in and says, I think this noble woman, it's often when there's a differential in status, I think, when someone like Sir Raiders is so important, so you really have to have, the stakes are high. And the father said, I'm happy to go to jail if you arrest her. And, but unfortunately, for a lot of the trials, we don't know what the genesis is. There isn't a document that says, I, the auditor, am going to now collect evidence because so-and-so reported on so-and-so. And so you have to kind of, you have to try and figure it out. And often it's a kind of communal, it's maybe not one person, but once there are 10 people, like say for the adultery case, the community was accused of adultery 5 years before, and they interviewed like 15 people in the community, the neighborhood, and most of them said, no, I don't think so. 5 years later, most of them said yes, definitely. And so once you have that kind of consensus, when you know you've got at least 6 to 8 witnesses who are going to come in, there have probably been rumors about things circulating for a while, but what the decision to prosecute, I suspect, is when you feel like you've got enough witnesses to really make this go forward. And in those cases, I have no evidence that somebody else went to jail for her, for example. It could have happened if it's not on the record.
Nathan, you were next in the queue.
That
And
actually
we'll
kind
get
of
Jacob.
goes into my question about status. You discussed somehow status went into this one case, the differing status between the two, and that differing status played a major role in their will to execute. But especially with all your counting, can you explain perhaps how much status played into this? Were there upper status people that exceptionally they tried to execute and brought torture against, and to what degree they were exceptional, or was it much more egalitarian?
Yeah, that's a great question. Overall, so if you look at the 16th and the 17th centuries together, the vast majority of people who are being accused of crimes and convicted of crimes are not elite. And so I'm calling elite those of bourgeois and citizenship status in Geneva. So there's people who, the men of this family can vote for the city councils, the citizens can serve in the small council, and nobody has done the quantitative work, so I'm not going to go do it. But so nobody said it's this many families and it's 2% of the population, but it's a minority of the population, certainly under 10% of the population. Those people in general tend not to show up as much. In other words, they're less visible in the records than it would suggest by the percentage of the population, which we don't know what they are. So I'm making various sort of guesstimates. But one exception is the 1560s. And so in the early 1560s, especially 1560 to 1565, there are a lot of high status people who are accused of capital crimes, of incest, of adultery, and are executed, like bizarrely large numbers. So Reformation Geneva historians said, look how equitable Geneva justice is, it's an equal opportunity. But I actually think I just finished an article for the Companion on the Geneva Reformation, and I make an argument, it's hard to make because we don't have the direct evidence, but there's so many of them, it's almost as if it's a political persecution. That after 1555, with the consolidation of the Calvinist party, if you will, the faction that really supports Calvin, that they had been using sedition charges as a way of trying to get rid of people, to either execute them or to banish them, to get them out of town. And they did this in 1555, a few months after the personnel in that small council changed, so there was a slight majority of Calvinists or Calvinist supporters. There was a riot, and that riot was used as an excuse to issue capital sentences against some of the parents, some of the other faction. And many people left town and fled, and they were some of them were banished, some of them were like capital sentences, but they were already gone. And in the years that followed, Bern, Geneva's patron, if you will, and put enormous pressure on the small council to let them back in. And they did it for the most part, to let them back in. But I think they kind of realized that this was a strategy that wasn't going to work, and that the way to get rid of people who are not conforming, people who are not, toeing the line, was to charge them with a sex crime that was, everybody agrees. Adultery was a capital crime in many places. Very rarely was the death sentence imposed. but it was a capital crime in many places in the 16th century. And so then if you get someone for adultery, then you've got rid of potentially a political opponent, but in a way that Barron can't say you're not allowed to prosecute adulterers. And it's very hard to prove that, although I have a couple of instances where it's very suggestive, where someone who was obviously associated with the Communist Party and is then prosecuted for adultery in 1560, and despite the fact that he and his wife tried to appeal it to the Council of 200, which is the council that bourgeois and citizen males can appeal, death sentences and other severe sentences, they're unsuccessful. So the Council of 200 says, yeah, execution's a good option in this case, And that's what I see happening in the 1560s, which is a bit different from earlier decades, where if you were high status enough, you could appeal your sentence, and often it would be mitigated. I think the Council of 200 would say, well, no, execution, banish, sort of, it would, but not in the early 1560s. There we see the small council, the Council of 200 united in, let's get rid of these people. So that's a hunch, and I don't know where to look for the definitive evidence, but it's not for me to do. I'm just making the suggested claim, and someone else can follow it up.
You might think of Al Soman's stuff on bestiality, of how all of the cases he looked at that, that were absurd, and that clearly they were after him for another reason, a lot of times treating mental illness. But the bestiality, nobody could argue with. Right. This is, somebody's having sex with a cow in the main square of town, and blah, blah, blah. This is, and it needs to be locked up and whatnot. And he found that, there's way too many cases that are exactly the same. That clearly it's not, in fact, what they're being prosecuted for.